Have you ever felt like you're running, but going nowhere? You're doing everything society told you to do, waking up early, hustling hard, chasing goals, but deep down, there's this strange emptiness, like you're being carried by something you can't control, a current, a tide, a stream that never stops. You check your phone, and there it is again, messages to reply to, deadlines waiting, the pressure to be on all the time. It's like you're swimming against a current so strong, that even when you stop, you still feel exhausted, and then the thoughts begin. Is this what life is supposed to feel like? Why do I feel so disconnected? Why do I feel like I'm drowning? Even when everything seems okay. If any of that feels familiar, you're not alone. This is the silent suffering of our times. We are surrounded by motion, but we have lost direction. We are immersed in noise, but we cannot hear our own voice. We are more connected than ever, but we feel completely alone. We are not living, we are drifting. Let me tell you a story. There was once a young woman named Sarah. She had a job at a fast-paced tech company. From the outside, her life looked perfect, a nice apartment, a good salary, a busy social life. But inside, she felt like she was unraveling. Every day felt like a race she didn't remember signing up for. She couldn't breathe deeply. She couldn't sleep peacefully. She felt like she was losing herself in a life that was always go, go, go. One day, while walking to work, she suddenly stopped, not because she wanted to, but because her body simply refused to go on. She stood on a crowded sidewalk as the city rushed past her, and in that moment, she realized something: everyone's in a hurry. But no one knows where they're going. Life today is a river that never stops flowing, and we are the ones trying to stand still in it, but instead of finding balance, we fight it. We try to control the current, push harder, swim faster, and the harder we resist, the more we suffer. The Buddha once said, life is like a river, ever changing, ever flowing. Trying to hold on to anything in it is like trying to grasp the water in your hands. That is the root of our suffering, not the river itself, but our refusal to understand it. You see, we are not lost because the world is fast. We are lost because we've forgotten how to be still. We've forgotten how to center ourselves. In the middle of the stream, the question is not, how do I escape this river? The question is, how can I stay centered, even as the water rushes all around me? This question lies at the heart of every spiritual journey, because in the practice of Buddhism, we don't seek to run away from life. We seek to understand it deeply, to see its impermanence, its patterns, its flow, and to find our balance within it. This video is not about escaping. It's not about quitting your job or running to the mountains. It's about learning how to live, here, now, in the middle of it all, and not just survive, but truly, deeply, wake up. Over the next chapters, we'll explore why the stream of life feels so overwhelming, how ancient Buddhist wisdom helps us stay grounded, and how simple practices, like breathing, walking, and seeing clearly, can change everything. We'll hear stories of those who learned to float instead of fight. We'll dive into real teachings that have stood the test of time, and slowly, gently, we'll begin to see that peace is not somewhere far away. It's not at the end of your to-do list. It's not in the next promotion, the next relationship, or the next vacation. Peace is what happens when you learn how to stop rushing, and start living, right in the stream, right in the now. So take a breath, let this be your first pause today. Feel the ground beneath you. You are here. You are alive, and this journey is just beginning. In Chapter 1, we opened our eyes to a deep truth, and often, we feel like we're drowning because we don't understand how it moves. But to stay centered in the stream of life, we must first understand the stream itself. So let's ask a simple, yet powerful question: what exactly makes life feel so unstable, so unpredictable, so overwhelming? The answer lies in one of the Buddha's core insights, anicca, the truth of impermanence. Everything changes, not some things, not most things, everything. The seasons change, our bodies change, thoughts arise and fade like clouds in the sky. Feelings surge, then disappear. Jobs, homes, relationships, identities, all appear, shift, and eventually dissolve, and yet, we resist this truth with all our strength. We want the good moments to last forever. We want love to stay exactly how it was at the beginning. We want our plans to go exactly the way we imagined. But life doesn't work like that. You cannot step into the same river twice, said Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher, because the river has changed, and so have you. This echoes the Buddha's teaching beautifully. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Dhammapada, think about it, how many times have you suffered, not because something bad happened, but because you couldn't let go of what was? We suffer when we try to freeze time, we suffer when we cling to a version of life that no longer exists. But here's the key, it's not the change itself that hurts us, it's our attachment to things staying the same. Let me share a story. There was once a monk who had a beautiful tea bowl, his only possession. It was handcrafted, with small imperfections that made it truly unique. He cherished it deeply. One day, a student accidentally knocked it off the table. The bowl shattered into pieces on the floor. The student gasped, expecting the monk to be furious, but the monk simply smiled and said, "Ah, it was already broken." The student was confused, so the monk explained, "From the moment I received that bowl, I knew it would one day crack, or fall, or fade away. It was already broken in my mind. So each time I used it, I appreciated it fully. Now that it's gone, I can let it go." This is what it means to live with the awareness of impermanence. It's not being cold. It's not detachment from life, it's the opposite. It's learning to truly love things while they last, because you know they won't last forever. When we resist change, we suffer. When we flow with it, we awaken. But here's the paradox, to find peace in impermanence, we must first confront it. That means we must stop numbing ourselves, stop running away, and instead, look directly at what we fear, the passing of time, the end of things, the reality that nothing lasts. Because once we see this clearly, once we truly accept impermanence, we begin to touch something deeper than fear. We touch freedom. Think of the falling leaves in autumn. Do they resist the wind? Do they scream in protest as they let go of the branch? No, they surrender to the season, and in doing so, they become part of something beautiful, a dance of change that colors the whole forest. In the same way, when we stop clinging to what must fall away, we too become graceful dancers in life's ever-changing rhythm. But accepting impermanence doesn't mean becoming passive, it means engaging with life fully, but without trying to trap it. Love deeply, knowing love will evolve. Work hard, knowing success will ebb and flow. Cherish people, knowing their presence is not guaranteed. And most importantly, be present, because this moment, right now, is the only one you truly have. Buddhist practice offers us tools for this. Mindfulness is one of them. It helps us notice the small shifts, the little beginnings and endings that occur all the time. A breath enters, then leaves. A thought arises, then disappears. A sound comes, then fades. Impermanence is not some far-off concept, it's happening every second. And the more we see it, the more we soften, the more we let go, the more we trust the flow of life. There's something surprisingly peaceful about impermanence, once you stop resisting it, because if everything changes, then pain will pass, so will confusion, so will loneliness. The storm will not last forever, just as the cherry blossoms bloom only for a short time. Their fleeting beauty reminds us to be present while they're here. You don't need to grasp, you only need to notice. And to appreciate deeply, before it's gone. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by life's changes, remember, it's not chaos, it's impermanence. And impermanence is not your enemy, it is the rhythm of existence itself. As you begin to understand the stream of life, you stop trying to control it, and start learning how to move with it. This is not weakness, this is wisdom. In the last chapter, we began to see the world as it truly is, impermanent, ever-changing, always flowing. And once we accept that the river of life never stops moving, a natural question arises: if everything is changing, then where can I stand? Is there any place in this world I can truly call home? The Buddha answered this not with a location, but with a realization. Peace is not found by rearranging the world, but by discovering your center within it. Imagine the eye of a hurricane. All around it, violent winds roar, chaos rages. But in the very center, there is absolute stillness. The world may spin, emotions may rise, people may come and go, but if you can find your inner still point, you become unshakable. Not because the world stopped spinning, but because you stopped spinning with it. Let me tell you about a man named Thomas. He was a doctor. Highly respected. Always busy, he thought he was balanced because he managed everything well. But then, his father passed away suddenly, his routine collapsed. His emotions stormed, he realized that beneath the surface of his controlled life, he had no center. Only distractions. In his search for healing, he stumbled upon a Zen retreat. There, for the first time in years, he sat, without doing, without solving, without running, just breathing, just being. And in the deep quiet of his practice, he discovered something profound, that there was a part of him untouched by his grief, unshaken by success or failure, calm even in chaos. It wasn't outside. It wasn't far away, it was within him, always had been, he just never knew how to return to it. This center the Buddha spoke of is not a physical place, it's not an escape, it is the awakened mind, the part of you that can observe everything, without being pulled by anything. It is the witness, the awareness behind your thoughts, the silent space between your breaths. Most people live only on the surface, reacting, chasing, clinging, fearing, but beneath all that noise, there is silence, and within that silence, clarity, presence, and profound freedom. Here's how the Buddha described it: just as a solid rock is not shaken by the wind, so the wise are not moved by praise or blame. To find your center is not to shut the world out, it is to be so grounded in awareness, that the world no longer controls you. You become like the lotus that grows in muddy water, untouched by the mud. But how do we find that still point? The answer is simple, yet not easy. We train the mind to return to the present moment, again, and again, and again. Each time you bring your attention back to the breath, you are returning home. Each time you feel the ground beneath your feet, you are remembering your center. Each time you watch your thoughts without getting pulled in, you are awakening to who you truly are. This is the heart of meditation, not to escape thoughts, but to observe them like clouds passing across the sky. You are the sky, your thoughts are just weather. Try it now. Close your eyes, if you can. Take one slow, deep breath. Feel it enter, feel it leave. Don't try to change anything, just watch, just be, that. Right there, is your center. It's been here all along, waiting. You don't need to fly to a monastery to discover this. You don't need to be free from problems or emotions. You simply need to pause, to become still, in the middle of movement, to become quiet, in the middle of noise. And this stillness, it's not a luxury, it's your birthright. When the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree, he didn't find peace by running away, he sat still. He faced his fears, he watched the storm pass, and in that stillness, he saw the nature of the mind. He woke up. You can too, not by copying his outer life, but by living his inner realization. So the next time life feels like too much, when the current of the river starts pulling you in, don't fight, don't run, return to your breath, return to your body, return to now, because now is where the stillness lives, and stillness is where wisdom begins. And as you begin to rest more in this center, you'll notice something miraculous. The world doesn't need to change for you to find peace. You are what changes. Your presence deepens. Your reactions soften, and the river no longer feels like a threat. You float, you glide, you trust. So far, we've understood the nature of the stream, impermanence, and we've begun to find our center within the chaos. But now, a new question arises: how do we move through this stream with compassion? How do we relate to others, to challenges, to life itself, from this place of stillness? In the last chapter, we uncovered something beautiful, that in the middle of chaos, we can discover stillness. But even when we find that still point within, life doesn't pause for our peace. Emails arrive. Arguments flare, the mind wanders. So how do we remain centered? Not just in silence, but in the noise? The answer is one of the Buddha's greatest teachings, mindfulness. Mindfulness is more than a trendy word, it's more than just being present. In Buddhist tradition, mindfulness, sati in Pali, is the awakened awareness that knows what is happening, as it is happening, without clinging or resisting. It is the compass that guides you through the stream of life. Not by predicting the future, but by deeply feeling the now. Let me tell you a story. There was a young monk, restless and frustrated. He had studied all the scriptures, he could chant by heart, but still, he felt anxious, lost. He went to the master and asked, "Why do I still suffer when I know so much?" The master smiled and handed him a cup of tea. As he poured, the tea began to overflow, hot liquid spilled everywhere. The young monk shouted, "Master, the cup is full." The master replied calmly, "Yes. Just like your mind. Full of thoughts, judgments, knowledge, there is no room for awareness to enter." You see, mindfulness isn't about thinking more clearly, it's about seeing more clearly. When you walk, walk, when you eat, eat, when you breathe, breathe, simple, yes. But in a world addicted to distraction, this simplicity is radical. Think of mindfulness as an anchor. The river of life is always moving, but mindfulness keeps you grounded, not stuck, but steady. Imagine yourself standing in a fast-flowing stream. If you flail, you fall. If you freeze, you drown. But if you plant your awareness, you feel the current, and flow with it. So how do we practice this? You don't need incense or silence or robes, you only need intention. Start with one breath, feel the inhale, feel the exhale. Now, notice your feet, are they tense? Relax them, feel the ground. Isn't it amazing? You're here. Now, this is mindfulness, not exotic. Not dramatic, but real, and in its realness, transformative. The Buddha taught the 4 foundations of mindfulness, a powerful framework to awaken the compass within you. 1. Mindfulness of the body, feel the breath. Notice posture. Ground yourself. 2. Mindfulness of feelings, are you grasping pleasure? Pushing pain away? 3. Mindfulness of the mind, is the mind calm? Restless? Focused? 4. Mindfulness of mental phenomena, what thoughts arise? What stories are playing? Each layer is a mirror, each moment is a doorway. You don't need to do it all at once. Even one conscious breath can interrupt a lifetime of unconscious patterns. Try this. The next time someone criticizes you, pause. Feel your breath, notice the heat in your chest, watch the thoughts, they don't understand me. I must defend myself. But don't follow them, just watch. In that pause, you're free. You've broken the chain. That's the power of mindfulness. Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese Zen master, once said, "Mindfulness is the energy that helps us recognize the conditions of happiness that are already present in our lives." What a beautiful reminder, that we don't practice mindfulness to get somewhere. We practice to wake up to what is already here. Your child's laughter, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the silence after a long day. So many miracles. We miss them, because we're not here. But mindfulness brings us home. It also helps us navigate pain. When sadness comes, mindfulness doesn't push it away. It says, "I see you. I'm here." When anger rises, mindfulness doesn't fuel it, it breathes with it. This gentle presence transforms pain into wisdom. It turns storms into teachers. Over time, mindfulness becomes more than a technique, it becomes a way of living. You walk slower, speak gentler, listen deeper, and in doing so, you move through the world, with grace, not reaction. This is what it means to stay anchored, not untouched by life, but deeply in touch with it, without drowning in it. So remember, stillness is your foundation, mindfulness is your compass, and awareness is the boat that carries you across the river of life. So far, we've learned how to find stillness and use mindfulness as an anchor, but the real challenge is, how do we stay centered in the world, fully engaged yet detached? How do we flow with life without losing ourselves? The Buddha taught us to live in the world without letting the world overwhelm us. It's about engagement without attachment, involving yourself fully, but not clinging to outcomes. This balance is key. There's a Zen story that perfectly illustrates this. A young monk asked his teacher, "How can I practice detachment?" The teacher smiled and poured tea into a cup, and kept pouring even as the tea overflowed. The monk said, "Master, the cup is full." The teacher replied, "Your mind is like this cup, full of distractions. To receive new teachings, you must first empty your cup." Detachment doesn't mean indifference, it means letting go of clinging. It's about living fully but not holding tightly. Think of a boat floating in a river. It moves with the current, but it doesn't drown in it. It's engaged in the flow, but it isn't lost in the flow. That's the way we should approach life, engaged yet detached. Let me share a story. Rena, a busy manager, felt overwhelmed by work. She realized that her anxiety was the result of clinging to success. Instead of quitting her job, she shifted her mindset. She observed her thoughts and stopped identifying with them. Now, she works with commitment, but without attachment. She flows like the boat, engaged, yet centered. Attachment comes when we forget the truth. Everything is impermanent. People, success, even our thoughts, they all come and go. When we let go of attachment, we can live fully without fear of loss. In Buddhist terms, upadana means clinging. Letting go of attachment doesn't mean we stop caring, it means we stop relying on the world to complete us. So, how can we flow without losing ourselves? Pause, breathe, and notice your attachments. Release them gently, remembering that all things are temporary. As we've seen, life's current can sometimes sweep us away, but there is a deeper wisdom that can help us stay anchored, no matter how turbulent the stream becomes. This wisdom doesn't just come from philosophy, it comes from the stories of those who have walked the path. In this chapter, let's draw inspiration from the lives of those who have found resilience in the face of life's challenges. Their stories reveal powerful lessons on how to remain centered, even when the world around us seems to crumble. Let me tell you the story of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, a symbol of compassion and wisdom. Avalokiteshvara, in one of his past lives, was a king, but despite his power and wealth, he couldn't escape the suffering of his people. One day, he meditated deeply, wishing to understand the cause of suffering. He saw that it was the attachment to desires that led people to pain. He vowed to help them free themselves from attachment. In that moment, he realized that true strength isn't in power, but in compassion and understanding. This story teaches us that resilience comes not from avoiding suffering, but from understanding its nature and learning to respond with compassion. Now, let's look at the story of Thich Nhat Hanh, a modern Buddhist monk who became a symbol of peace and wisdom. In the midst of the Vietnam War, Thich Nhat Hanh faced unimaginable suffering. But instead of responding with anger or hatred, he chose peace. He once said, "Peace is every step." For him, resilience didn't mean escaping the pain of life, it meant facing it with mindfulness and compassion, one step at a time. He teaches us that resilience is not about avoiding difficulties, but about embracing them with awareness and love. Now, let's consider the story of the Buddha himself. Before he became enlightened, the Buddha was a prince named Siddhartha. He lived a life of luxury, but he was deeply troubled by the sight of human suffering. He left his palace to seek the truth of existence. In his search, he faced immense challenges, hunger, pain, and temptation, but instead of turning away, he embraced these challenges. Understanding that suffering is an inseparable part of life, he found resilience in the acceptance of suffering, and in doing so, he transformed his pain into wisdom. These stories show us that resilience doesn't mean being unshakable in the face of hardship, it means embracing life as it is, with all its pain and joy, and responding with compassion, awareness, and wisdom. Let me share a modern story of resilience. There was a woman named Clara who faced many hardships in her life. She lost her job, went through a divorce, and struggled with illness, but through all of this, Clara learned to cultivate a resilient mind. She didn't ignore her pain, nor did she become bitter. Instead, she practiced mindfulness every day, focusing on the present moment, and over time, she found healing. One day, Clara said to a friend, "I don't know if the pain will ever go away, but I know that I am no longer afraid of it." In that moment, Clara had found the center we all seek. She had found strength not by avoiding life's challenges, but by embracing them with an open heart and an open mind. These stories are not just inspiring, they are practical teachings. They show us that resilience doesn't come from denying our struggles, it comes from facing them with clarity, compassion, and wisdom. We can all learn to stay centered, even when life's currents pull us in unexpected directions. As we wrap up this chapter, take a moment to reflect. Think about someone you admire for their resilience. It might be a teacher, a spiritual figure, or even someone in your personal life. What did they teach you about strength? What qualities did they embody that helped them stay centered in the flow of life? Remember, resilience is not about being perfect, it's about being present, about learning from every experience, and about finding wisdom in the midst of suffering. As we near the end of our journey together, let's pause, take a deep breath, and feel the stillness around you. Remember, you've already begun your journey. You've learned about the river of life and the importance of staying centered, even as the current sweeps us along. You've discovered the nature of impermanence, the strength of mindfulness, and the wisdom that comes from engaging in life without losing yourself. Now, it's time to stay still. Not still in the sense of avoiding life, but still in the sense of finding your center in the flow of the present moment. In our modern world, we are often pushed to move faster, to keep up with the current, to reach the next destination. But remember, the journey is the destination. Just like a river that flows with purpose, your journey is about learning to move with life, not against it. We've explored many teachings in this series, but the most important lesson I want to leave you with is this: the path to peace begins with acceptance. Acceptance of life as it is, without judgment, without the need to control. This doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent. It means you flow with life's ups and downs, without clinging to either. In every challenge, in every moment of difficulty, there's a lesson, a deeper wisdom waiting to be discovered, and each time you stay centered, even for a moment, you deepen your connection to the stream of life. Now, as we reach the end of our time together, I invite you to reflect on the journey we've shared. Think of the lessons you've learned, the insights that have shifted the way you view the world. The real work, however, begins now. What will you do with these teachings? How will you apply them in your life, in the midst of the river that carries you forward? Remember, you are the river, flowing with the wisdom and peace you've cultivated. As you continue, don't rush ahead or look back. Just stay present, stay still, and flow deep. Your journey is just beginning. Thank you for joining me on this path of mindfulness and wisdom. May you always find your center, no matter where life's current takes you.